Hey everyone, Chris here. Thanks for checking out the podcast. If you're enjoying it and learning something along with us, please consider becoming a supporting patron at patreon.com/ateacherhistory. Or you could leave a rating and review on iTunes. It would be a huge help. If you'd like to raise your hand and participate along with us, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, @ateacherfist, or shoot me an email, chris@ateacherhistory.com. All right, let's get on to the next episode. Hello, welcome into A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me again today. Did you know that the invention of the cotton gin and the Industrial Revolution in England, which then spread to the North, erased any dreams of American slavery dying out in the United States naturally? And that through the increased reliance on slavery in the South and the westward push following the invention of the cotton gin, the population of the state of Alabama from 1810 to 1820 increased by 1,400%. And that after the international slave trade was outlawed in 1808, it was the internal slave trade that was at times just as horrific to the slave and critical to the continued growth of the institution itself. Did you know all of that? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out, because today we will cover that and more in episode 117, King Cotton, Part 1. All right, everyone, welcome in to episode 117. Before we dive in, two quick book recommendations for you. The first covers slavery primarily leading up to this period that we're in now, so it would be really good for context and better understanding. It's by Ira Berlin. It's called Many Thousands Gone, the First 2 Centuries of Slavery in North America. The second focuses a lot more on the topic at hand, or I should say the time period at hand. And it's by Walter Johnson. It's called Soul by Soul, Life Inside the Antebellum Slave Market. And it's really interesting because it is a perspective from the slave market and the buying and selling of slaves, as opposed to the the farming and the physical labor they were put through on the plantations, and some of the arguments that Johnson makes about how the market itself, the buying and selling, was the core to American slavery is interesting, and I really liked it. It was a little bit of a slow read, but it was really good. All right, so let's dive in. Last week, we talked a lot about the election of 1828 and the sweeping political victory of General Andrew Jackson over John Quincy Adams. We noted just how bad things got between the two political camps, with the election often going down as one of the most vicious and disrespectful of any presidential campaign in American history. As we will continue to follow the narrative of American politics over the next 35 years, though, you will see that the tension in the United States will only continue to rise, with political discord leading to civil strife. At this time in the U.S., many Americans in both the North and the South began to realize that there was more on the line in these elections than just who took over the position of president. With Northern and Southern societies developing so differently from each other economically, politically, and socially, it became more and more challenging for them to live and operate together under the same political system. Each American election brought with it higher and higher stakes, with the outcome potentially significantly impacting the life, business, and livelihood of Americans in the North and the South. Before we dive into Andrew Jackson's presidency, which was full of things we need to talk about, I wanted to take a step back for a few weeks and set the scene of the United States that we will be encountering during this antebellum period. It is so important to at least have a decent grasp on what is going on in the southern and northern societies during this time period so we can better understand why the conflicts we will encounter in future episodes warranted such strong emotional and political actions and reactions from Americans all over the United States. The South's reliance on the slavery economy and the North's industrial and manufacturing boom led many Americans to feel part of a divided nation, a division that was gaining momentum and seemed to be a boulder rolling down a hill with nothing to stop it. As you likely know by this point, Southern society in the antebellum America was more or less dominated by the systematic enslavement of African Americans. We've taken the time to cover some of the origins of American slavery and its impact in the colonial North American region in other episodes of this podcast. And what we will see as we dive into this episode today is that while American slavery waned a bit in the early days following the Revolution, the invention of the cotton gin and the massive profitability of this industry saw the Southern economy double down on slavery, heavily influencing their social, political, and economic composition. Laying the groundwork for this episode takes us to the early 1790s, where short staple cotton was an emerging crop in the American South. It was very suitable to the Southern climate and soil, but it had one major problem. It was painstakingly difficult and time-consuming to tear the seeds away from the cotton lint. It would take some an entire day to hand clean 1 pound of cotton. Enter Eli Whitney and his cotton gin. In 1793, Eli Whitney, a graduate from Yale College, found himself tutoring the children of the late great Revolutionary War hero Nathanael Greene. Greene's widow, Catherine, was a plantation owner and a sharp businesswoman. While Whitney was living in South Carolina working, he started experimenting with an idea he had. After some tinkering, he created the prototype of the cotton engine, nicknamed the cotton gin. This device would mechanically help separate the seeds from the cotton lint at an incredibly efficient pace. With the cotton gin, it was possible to clean up to 50 pounds of cotton a day, which at that time was just a staggering number. What Whitney didn't know in that moment was that his invention was going to dramatically change Southern society in the United States and supercharge the spread of African American slavery. 20 years after Whitney's invention, the areas of South Carolina and Georgia were producing 60 million pounds of cotton each year, exporting most of it to England. Following the War of 1812, Southerners wanted to take advantage of this new technology, and seeing how cotton depleted the soil, although not as much as tobacco, and especially the soil further to the east, there became a push for Western settlement in states like Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Between 1810 and 1820, this Alabama fever, as the migration became nicknamed, saw the population of Mississippi more than double, and the population of Alabama grow from 9,000 people to over 144,000 in just a 10-year period. Of course, with this came the displacement of Native Americans, who were already living in this land and had rightful claims to it. We've covered in some detail, the Creek Wars and subsequent treaties that pushed natives further west, and in a future episode we'll discuss the forced migration of 1838, otherwise known colloquially as the Trail of Tears. There will be more migrations west in the 1830s and 1850s, and southern cotton farming will eventually push as far west as the eastern portions of present-day Texas. In what seemed to be a serendipitous parallel to Southern farmers and slaveholders, the Industrial Revolution in England had been gaining momentum for the past couple generations. With the advances of technology came the ability to mass-produce unprecedented amount of cotton cloth. With a market for cotton such as industrialized England and later the northern parts of the United States, Eli Whitney's invention couldn't have come at a better time to Southern plantation owners, businessmen, and traders. In fact, the South relied so heavily on the cotton trade, and keep in mind, this cotton wasn't just going to England, right? It was also heading to the North and other countries. But the South relied so heavily on the cotton trade that by the time of the outbreak of the Civil War, cotton exports made up 60% of all Southern exports, a cool $200 million. In fact, the South became so bullish on the world's reliance on their cotton that just a couple years prior to the outbreak of the Civil War, Senator James Henry Hammond of South Carolina said, quote, "Without firing a gun, without drawing a sword, should they make war on us, we could bring the whole world to our feet. What would happen if no cotton was furnished for 3 years? England would topple headlong and carry the whole civilized world with her, save the American South. No, you dare not make war on cotton. No power on the earth dares to make war upon it. Cotton is king." Interestingly enough, it wasn't just England who relied on the trade. Many of the insurance companies who insured the cotton trade, along with the ships used in the trade, belonged to northern companies in the United States. As these companies made money off the cotton trade, they reinvested it in northern manufacturing, just like they had done years before with the Atlantic slave trade. But with cotton increasing in value and the rest of the world becoming more dependent upon it, the horrific reality was that the growth of African American slavery was needed in order to support this booming industry. This, of course, increased the division and tension between the North and the South. After the Revolutionary War, all of the northern states in the U.S. either emancipated their slaves or passed laws that outlined the gradual emancipation of slavery. If you've been listening to this podcast, you know that slavery was the elephant in the room in the conversation surrounding the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution. In fact, the Founding Fathers saw the specific practice of the international slave trade so repulsive that they included in the Constitution the outlawing of the slave trade 20 years down the road, in 1808. Unfortunately, though, as we know, the founders were not able to, or maybe more accurately, chose not to, include anything about emancipating the slaves. Some who were opposed to slavery believed that with the momentum that had begun in the North, slave owners would eventually come around to deciding to emancipate their slaves, while others avoided the topic as they were uncomfortable with it or thought it would be a losing argument, or both. And you may be thinking, seriously, Chris, you're telling me that some people thought slave owners in the South would give up their slaves voluntarily? Come on. And if you're thinking that, I get it. Especially in retrospect, with the explosion of cotton growth, it seems pretty unthinkable. But Thomas Jefferson himself even remarked that a, quote, total emancipation with the consent of the masters was in America's future. So it was actually something in the back of their minds. Another reason for this was that before the Industrial Revolution and the rise of cotton, the most proliferous crop and the one that relied most on slave labor was tobacco. And tobacco really exhausted its soil, giving it a much shorter outlook. But as you can imagine, and as I just implied, the invention of the cotton gin and the international reliance on Southern American cotton changed all of that. Cotton and its production truly was a cash crop. It was good as gold. And those are the same types of things people used to say about tobacco. But cotton was far more profitable than tobacco. And Southern slave owners knew it. They were not going to slow down production of this crop for fear of missing out on the incredible financial opportunity that was in front of them. They worked their slaves all day, every day, in the scorching southern summer heat, and as the demand for cotton rose, so did the demand for slavery, and in turn the moral and economic justifications of the system itself. And I know that the South grew crops other than cotton, but cotton's profitability made it by far the most focused crop in the South. In fact, a British tourist in Alabama joked that, quote, people live in cotton houses and ride in cotton carriages. They buy cotton, sell cotton, think cotton, eat cotton, drink cotton, and dream cotton. They marry cotton wives, and unto them are born cotton children. Because of the nature of the Southern slave society, class systems began to emerge in much sharper contrast than in the North. Additionally, the urban growth that was happening in the North at this time was non-existent in the South, along with very little industrialization in canals and railroads. By the dawn of the Civil War, 85% of the nation's factories were in the North, and 2/3 of the nation's railroads. And this made sense. The cotton industry relied on large tracts of land and slave labor. Why would they want to introduce more industry into the South and begin to incorporate the ideas of free wage labor? What they had going for them, especially with cotton in such high demand, was working. The more tightly this system could be controlled, the safer, and thus the more profitable. But the restraints that the slave society was putting on Southern progress, ironically, was what began to threaten its staying power. As we've talked about in this podcast, with urban growth, industrialization, and transportation really taking off in the North, the population of those states were growing at a rapid pace, while the South was much more stagnant. With this, the North and the Northwest began to dominate politically. This will cause significant political tension and something we discussed in episode 115 with the introduction of the concept of the doctrine of nullification. In addition to the Southern states losing their political power, anti-slavery sentiment was also growing in the North. With the British outlawing slavery on their sugar plantations in the West Indies, and events like the Missouri Compromise making it clear to the South that many in the North were committed to stopping the spread of slavery, Southern slaveholders and politicians felt like the walls were slowly, yet surely, closing in on them. So we've talked quite a bit about the broader context of slavery and how the cotton boom drove more demand for slavery and increased Southern dependence. But what was it actually like to have to live through these horrors? Well, no one today can say they know for sure, but we do have a plethora of resources to help us better understand and sympathize with the hardships that slaves faced. As I mentioned a few moments ago, the international slave trade was outlawed in 1808, and somewhat surprisingly, it was actually more or less eliminated from American society. Thus, Southern slaveholders had to rely upon a natural repopulation of their slaves. During this explosive growth of the cotton crop, we also see more reliance on larger plantations, with slaves grouped together. 75% of the slave population was living on land with 10 or more slaves. Thus, the slave population's distribution was becoming more and more disproportionate. Additionally, on these larger plantations, there was more of an impersonal relationship between the slave and master, and an increased fear in some type of slave insurrection. Because naturally, if you're a slave owner who owns 3 slaves, you're far less worried about a rebellion than if you are a slave owner who owns 103 slaves. With this, slaves on these larger plantations were often treated far worse, with overseers making sure they consistently enforced brutal disciplinary action to fend off any chances of an organized revolt. The one positive thing to come out of these larger plantations? An African American community and culture was born. Now, something we'll talk more about next episode. Unfortunately, though, it was difficult to maintain it during this antebellum era. With the growth of cotton igniting these migrations to the West and Southwest, slaves were sold off the new areas, sometimes with their families and sometimes without. This internal slave trade was critical to the continued growth of slavery in the United States, especially after the international slave trade was outlawed. With the increased demand for slaves in the Deep South, states in the Upper South like Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee sold their slaves, quote, down the river to these areas. In the years between 1820 and 1860, nearly 50% of the slave population of the Upper South was sold into the cotton-rich areas of the Deep South. During this time, more slaves were either sold down south or were uprooted and forced to migrate south and west than all of the Africans brought over to the United States in the 200 years of the international slave trade. So how did all of this work? Well, slave traders would travel north to these upper South states like Maryland and Delaware and buy slaves from their owners. Slaves were then gathered together in slave pens in cities like Richmond, Norfolk, Wilmington, Baltimore, Nashville, or Charleston, and moved further south and further west by train or boat. Solomon Northup, a former slave, once recalled his time in a slave pen, writing that, quote, "We were now conducted into a large room in the front part of the building to which the yard was attached, in order to be properly trained before the admission of customers. The men were arranged on one side of the room, the women on the other. During the day, he, the trader, exercised us in the art of looking smart and or moving to our places with exact precision." After being trapped in these slave pens, slaves were then transported one of two ways to their destination. The common phrase of being sold down the river came from the tendency to have slaves carried as cargo on steamships on the Mississippi River. But more often than not, the slaves would be transported on foot, with their feet chained together to prevent them from escaping. And keep in mind, not all of these slaves traveled or were sold with their family members. Some, oftentimes teens, were sold off by their owner all by themselves, or with only part of their nuclear family, never to see their relatives ever again. This trip from the Upper South into the Deep South regions of King Cotton was sometimes referred to as the Second Middle Passage. They were sent to cities like New Orleans, Natchez, or Mobile. In these cities, thousands of slaves were sold every year. They were dressed in new clothes put on by the slave trader and sometimes forced to perform physical exercises to prove their health. They were poked and prodded like cattle by the suspicious and dubious buyers, often having to be stripped fully nude, both male and female, to verify the trader's claims of health and strength for their property. While doing this, buyers would have a keen eye on the back of a slave. Too many scars from lashes and whippings meant that the slave was likely too rebellious, or often didn't follow directions. For that was the most common reason slaves would be whipped. Those who did arrive at these slave markets with their relatives often had their pleas of please, please, please maintaining their family unity fall on deaf ears, as slave buyers were businessmen and rarely convinced to make a bad business decision by buying a relative for the sake of it. And to make matters worse, not only did some slaves experience forced separation from their loved ones, but the work they had to endure when they did arrive at their plantations was often backbreaking. With the profit that could be made in cotton, slave owners who owned cotton farms pushed their slaves to another extreme. Many slaves who came from smaller farms or more benevolent owners had a really difficult time adjusting to the conditions they were put through in the old Southwest. Because of this, owners and overseers knew that there would be a lot of resentment and tension within their slave populations, so they went out of their way to try to mitigate calamitous consequences, setting up gang systems of labor and oversight. This gang system didn't just exist on cotton farms, but was often deployed on tobacco and sugar plantations too. So, how does it work? Well, for something like cotton, the job was year-round. Slaves worked from can see to can't see, or sun up to sundown, pretty much every single day all year long. It wasn't uncommon for a slave to work an 18-hour day during the peak season of cotton picking either. They would work in large groups, and they would be watched over by an overseer or a patrol. Now, in the rest of this episode, I'll be describing some of the more extreme and repulsive aspects of slave life on a plantation. But do keep in mind it wasn't like this everywhere. There were slave owners who prided themselves on taking care of their slaves, keeping them healthy, and not overworking them. Charles Ball, a slave in Maryland, South Carolina, and Georgia, reflected on his time as a slave and wrote that, quote, "Although the slaves were treated with so much rigor and oftentimes with so much cruelty, I have seen instances of the greatest tenderness of feeling on the part of their owners. I myself had 3 masters in Maryland, and I cannot say now, even after having resided so many years in a state where slavery is not tolerated, that either of them used me worse than they had the moral right to do, regarding me as nearly an article of property and not entitled to any rights as a man, political or civil." From another perspective, a wealthy Louisiana slaveholder named Bennett Barrow published his Rules for a Plantation in 1838, detailing how slave owners should structure their business and treat their slaves. In it, he wrote, quote, "You must make the slave as comfortable at home as possible, affording him what is essentially necessary for his happiness. You must provide for him yourself, and by that means create in him a habit of perfect dependence on you." At first blush, you may think, wow, doesn't sound that bad. I mean, Barrow was even making the slaves' home comfortable and providing everything that they needed. Man, this guy was the most benevolent slave owner ever. And he may have been. But the important thing to note is why Barrow said this. In these rules of the plantation, Barrow details all types of ways to keep total control over his slaves that he, quote, treats so well. One of them was to keep them from ever leaving and be influenced by an outside source, which is why he said the plantation needs to have everything the slave needs. Also, Barrow is sure to point out that if the slave owner is the one providing everything, then the slave is wholly dependent on the owner, thus not allowing him any sense of freedom, independence, or any options to survive outside of the plantation. And look, I bring up a guy like Barrow not to in any way justify or explain away American slavery. And that's really important that I put out there. In fact, when I've heard people bring up ideas of benevolent slaveholders as some type of justification for slavery, and yes, I have actually had people in the 21st century argue that to my face, I recognize one of two things. They're likely incredibly uncomfortable with the realities of our history with slavery, or they're just unaware of it. Or maybe both. Because the important thing to understand about slavery is the one thing it takes away from people no matter how great the conditions are, and that is your freedom. Human beings are on this earth to grow, expand, and challenge themselves in new ways and to experience new things. Nothing is more empowering than the feeling that you are in control of your life, and nothing is more disempowering and dispiriting than living in a society where you aren't. So please don't misconstrue my mentioning of benevolent slave owners. I'm in no way justifying, explaining away, or whitewashing this part of our American history. I just wanted to let you know that there were slave owners who did run their plantations with a more well-meaning approach, even if by our standards today, their behavior would still be horrific to many. So now it's time to turn our attention to the large majority of slave plantations, those that weren't so benevolent. As I mentioned with this gang system of labor, the hierarchy had the slaves at the bottom and an overseer managing their daily tasks. These overseers would carry with them a whip, and their job was to ensure that the slaves were being productive and meeting their daily goals. Some overseers were brutal, and it wasn't just mean-spirited, but often it was strategic. Many plantation owners believed that the heavier the hand, the more disciplined and fearful their slave population would be. Thus, they would have to worry less about insurrection. A former slave, Francis Henderson, described his experience with an overseer. Quote, "Many a time, when we didn't know he was anywhere around, he would be in the woods watching us. First thing we would know, he would be sitting on the fence looking down upon us. And if any had been idle, the young master would visit him with blows. I have known him to kick my aunt, an old woman who had raised and nursed him, and I have seen him punish my sisters awfully with hickories from the woods." Solomon Northup, recalling his experiences in such an environment, said, quote, "It was rarely a day passed by without one or more whippings. The delinquent who had not picked enough cotton was taken out, stripped, and made to lie upon the ground, face downwards, when he received a punishment proportioned to his offense. It is the literal, unvarnished truth that the crack of the lash and the shrieking of the slaves can be heard from dark until bedtime on this plantation, any day almost during the entire period of cotton picking season." The battle of wills between slaves, overseers, and owners also sometimes resulted in the murder of a slave, which sometimes was brought to court, but not always. And the more general violence of excessive punishment, abuse, and rape, well, these were charges that were far more common and rarely punished. Sexual abuse of female slaves, often at the hands of the slave owner, was a common problem on many plantations, with the female slaves unable to protect themselves or prevent it from happening. Numerous slave owners fathered children with their female slaves through such attacks, often denying the existence of the offspring so as not to admit their actions. The overlooked victim in these situations, actually, an additional victim, was the slave owner's wife, powerless to publicly protest her husband's actions within the hierarchical structure of Southern society. One such woman, Mary Chestnut, confided in her diary, quote, "God forgive us, but ours is a monstrous system. Like the patriarchs of old, our men live all in one house with their wives and their concubines, and the mulattoes one sees in every family partly resemble the white children. Any lady is ready to tell you who the father of all the mulatto children in everybody's household are but her own. Those, she seemed to think, drop from the clouds." As you pack up your things, I'd like you to begin to consider what type of impact this treatment of an entire race of people will have on them in both the short and long term. Generation after generation of African Americans grew up in these slave societies, with hundreds of thousands of them never knowing life outside this reality. In addition to this, consider the impact it had on the prejudice of white Americans in the South. Being born into a family that owned slaves, or maybe you were born into a family that was related to slave owners, well, heck, just living in a society where it was so normalized caused these populations to become desensitized to not only the injustice of the institution itself, but also the horrors of the day-to-day experience. Next week, we'll talk more about this slave society and provide you some more context to the dynamic tension that existed in the South. We will also talk about some of the efforts from slaves to do something about it, rebelling against their owners and trying to change their future prospects, which, unfortunately, only led to increased disciplinary actions and poorer treatment for other slaves in the many years that followed. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed.